I have like kind of categorized my work in terms of like what I do to make a living and what I do for myself. And the kind of work that I've been putting up is kind of self-directed. And if I make nothing out of it, I'm okay with that, because then that means that like I'm not doing it for a particular audience, even though an audience is very much like part of the process, like me having a conversation, even if I never hear the other side.
Hey, welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast, brought to you by CloudSpot, the easiest way to deliver and sell your photos online. Hey, I am your host, Raymond Hatfield, and each week I interview one of the world's most interesting photographers to learn what it really takes to capture beautiful images and compelling stories so that you can start to do the same. In today's interview, we are chatting with fine art photographer Melanie Osaka. Now, Melanie's message, I think, is going to resonate with you and just so many today, because we, at least here in America, we live in this world that is so focused on productivity or side hustles and making money that Melanie's purely creative approach is super refreshing to hear about. On top of the fact that she's very knowledgeable about photography, the history of photography, and has created some really interesting images. It's great. And of course, she has the courage to try something new. That's a big thing. So even though deep down I know that, at least I think that, we all know what we should do when it comes to making a decision, Melanie just seems to be much better at listening to the answers from within. So with that, let's go ahead and get on into today's interview with Melanie Osaka. Melanie, I know that one of the things that I got excited for when I first saw your work was just how, I think, different it was, and not different in a way that is like, whoa, this is really far out there, but different in a way that I could feel something, I think, from your photographs. And I think that we are living in this world now where people are just so excited to share all of their photographs to where sometimes they feel like they don't have a lot of meaning, and yours do. To me, they speak to me, which is really exciting. Before you got to this point, I'm sure that you didn't just wake up one morning and you were fantastic with a camera. You were ready to go aces. So I want to know, Melanie, how did photography start for you?
Thank you so much for the way that you just like spoke about my work. It really does mean a lot when, especially being in academia and like making work and being like very theoretical about things. But then when you're like in the outside world, don't know whether it's just all in your head. So I love that. So I started first, I did my degree in graphic design, and that's like my friend behind.
Hi, no worries.
So I started a degree in graphic design, and once I graduated, I was very much interested in making books and I was very analog. So I was like making prints, and I was always really interested in having like using traditional methods of image making. And then I got into photography more for a documentary point of view. So it was just kind of like, I've always had a camera since I was young, but it was always kind of just documenting families and just documenting moments in time so that I could recall if either I was going to sketch it or draw or paint. So I was always using it as a form of document. It was never the final piece. It was like just part of my process of making images or making work. And then as I got interested in actual cameras and how cameras worked and how it's so weird because I've like always been around cameras, but once you start really understanding the mechanics, like how it's put together and how it functions, it becomes like really interesting. Or it became very interesting to me, and I became obsessed with like learning as much of photography as possible. And so then one of my first jobs, once I graduated from uni during my undergrad, was working in Snappy Snaps, which is a photography shop. So we mostly like do print on demand, so like do photo shoots with families, and you kind of have everything from printing stationeries to doing like business stuff, business cards, or like taking photos for fashion shoots and stuff. So it's kind of like just a lot of different aspects of photography. And then I decided to do my master's, but I didn't know, throughout the year, I was interested in always doing my master's and then going on to do a PhD, but I didn't know what subject I wanted to do it in. And I actually went to the RCA for the interview, actually for the opening, thinking I was going to go into print. and then decided to just go to the photography talk because I started assisting other photographers at that time as well. And everyone just kept saying photography is better. Or in terms of like it's more challenging or it's more theoretical. And there's a lot of conversations around image making more so than the actual like craft of making images. And I thought I was okay with the craft of making images in terms of like the processes, but I wanted to know why people made images and why we continue to grapple with and share images. Yeah, so then I went to the RCA, went to actually talk to a friend and everything, and then ended up applying for photography. I got into photography, which is I think is like a surprise because a lot of people are like, oh, you should go for print because it might be easier to get into because of the fact that like the work that I had was very print orientated. Yeah, so that's basically how I got into photography.
Why do you think, as a kid, you said that you pretty much had a camera your whole life growing up? Why did you not pursue photography, but instead graphic design?
I've always been interested in art, and I thought I didn't understand photography because I didn't know the history of photography. And I also didn't appreciate the history of photography because I just thought you take a picture and you've got it. And that's going from film to kind of early SLR cameras, like the really digital ones. And I was always that person who had a camera with me to like document more so because I had a terrible memory. I mean, I've got a good memory, but like I don't like writing, and it was just a really easy way of like documenting things.
Yeah.
I'm also dyslexic, but I didn't know at the time. So that's probably why I had a camera with me all the time. And I also didn't appreciate photography in the way that it was taught in school. So I studied in secondary school. I studied fine arts, and then I also studied product design because I went to a technology school. So we ended up like being able to do a lot of arts. So I had quite a lot of like arts GCSEs when I graduated, like when I finished. And then I went in to do art and design and then also graphic design in my A levels. And then during that time, I found out that we could do a foundation. But even before that, I didn't know that foundation existed. So when I actually went to apply for degrees, and I actually got into all the ones that I did, but then a lot of my friends were going to do foundation. And I just kind of wanted to explore more about what foundation, and also it was free. So it was like, oh, wow, maybe I should just take a year and just kind of explore all the different types of arts. Yeah, and then even through that, I was like kind of dabbling with photography because even in foundation, we did like a week of photography and we actually went into the darkroom, and I loved being in the darkroom. But yeah, it was always like, I think I went into graphic design because I enjoyed being given a brief. I like being told what kind of work to make. Otherwise, I wouldn't really make anything. And there was always the deadlines, and I enjoyed being given a deadline and a structure. And whereas I felt like within fine arts or like within other arts, it was kind of open-ended. You could keep going. And if I could keep going, I probably wouldn't make anything.
Yeah,
I'll always just be thinking about what I could possibly make.
Oh, that is so funny. I feel such a similar way. I was listening to another podcast recently that was basically saying like the more constraints that you can give yourself, the more creative you can be. And I think that the majority of listeners are those who are new to photography. And we kind of get this idea when we pick up that camera for the first time of like, I'm just going to document everything. And then we ultimately, I think maybe we just don't have a sense of direction and just nothing gets documented. But it's not until you're told. There's tons of sites that do like photography assignments, right? Photograph things that are red, photograph things, shadows. And it's like once we have those creative constraints, the work that we can produce is a whole lot more powerful. So that's great to hear that you're like that as well. I didn't know if maybe I was the only person. I want to know though, so what was it about? So you went for graphic design, right? And then you switched to pursue your master's in photography. Was there a moment in between there that maybe a certain photo stood out to you or you took a certain photo, or what was it that made you change your mind?
I don't actually think I changed my mind. It was because of the fact that like the degree in graphic design that I did, we shared a studio with illustration. And so our course was very open, and I did everything from creating the content to actually making the product. So, for example, I made a lot of books. So I actually got the content. Like if it was a if it was a project about, let's say, Brighton, I went to school in Brighton, so we would go around collecting all the content, making all the content, and then also going into a book binding studio and actually sewing together the book. Or like if I was doing print or like screen printing, I'll create the imagery, whether it was a photograph or it was a actual illustration that I created, and then like make things out of it. So I was always interested in image making. So I still don't really think that I've switched. More so I've like kind of honed in on like what I'm interested in at the moment. And I feel like a lot of times graphic design to a lot of people is very much about like making logos and or like creating catalogs, and it is, but also there's so much to it and so much aspects to it that I feel like I've just gone a little bit more niche in my interest, and that's what like, and I kind of had to do that because of the fact that I was saying that like I was very much interested in cameras and how cameras worked. And one of the projects that I did when I was doing graphic design was I basically walked around. A lot of times in Brighton, people leave out their printers, whether they got a new one, so the printer still works, or like something broken with it. So I was like going around picking all of people's like printers and then taking it apart and creating a drawing machine out of it. And I was like basically like a CNC machine. Yeah. So that was like a project that I did for fun, but then it's also something that I ended up doing as like a self-directed project. But it was like within graphic design, or at least the graphic design that I was studying, we could do that, and that was fine. And it wasn't just about like designing logos and branding. It was it was very much about like being given a brief and like being given a constraint about creating, I don't even remember what that project was called, but it was like something like going outside and documenting typefaces and like recording typefaces. Now, once you like just looking at typefaces, you can end up making anything. So I ended up, so another project, I'd make like 3D sculptures of fonts that I've seen outside.
Wow.
Yeah. So kind of coming from that, like my work was very much image driven. And I was very much also interested in type and fonts because of the fact that like, I mean, at that point I didn't really know because I ended up like later being diagnosed as being dyslexic, but I always like thought of like text in a very image based. Like whenever I'm trying to recall how to spell something, I'm trying to remember what it looks like and the shape of it more so than the actual characters that make it.
Wow, that's really interesting. So when it comes to the photography side of things, I come from more of, I guess, graphic design. I don't think has really played a big part in my life as much as just holding the camera and being able to, I guess, create something in front of me simply with that tool. So coming from the graphic design side and falling in love with cameras and how to produce an image, what are the biggest similarities? Like what connects the two for you with such excitement? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. I just think that I think of it as one in the same, because within graphic design, when it was about being given a task to do and carrying it out and trying to figure out how the best way to create that, I feel like I realized that within graphic design, photography was my starting point. And I wanted to learn more about the starting point more so than the finish, packaged goods. And I wanted to spend more time learning about the kind of history and like kind of giving photography its, not like it's due, but I was very dismissive about photography as I grew up because it was something that was easily accessible. And I think even now it's very much accessible, even more so. But learning about the kind of foundations and like the basics of photography made me really want to learn more about it and it as its own entity and not as a byproduct of trying to make something else, if that makes sense. So like, yeah, I think for me, yeah, photography is kind of like a starting point for me to do any type of like graphic based work, even though I've like moved away from that a little bit.
I see. From a education standpoint, what's been the hardest part technically for you to learn about photography?
I'm not too sure. I think I'm still learning about like the other photographers and like other genres. And I wouldn't say it's difficult, but I think there are like almost gatekeepers as to how much information you get. And I felt like I probably had to go to the RC or like go to an institution to be able to learn more or get like more information, because I couldn't just get that off of the internet. And actually, no, I want to change my answer. So I think it's more about like the kind of the hardest part of photography or like within the art is like being able to kind of categorize my work is really hard, or not hard for me, but like hard for others to understand what I do, even though I'm like making it, if that makes sense.
Why do you think that's important?
It's important because when people have like group shows, or like when, even though we like to say that we don't like to pigeonhole people, or like we shouldn't categorize people's works, we do. And so therefore, if you're doing anything within photography that is almost outside of kind of maybe like straight photography, or like in terms of like portrait, like actual portraits or landscape or the kind of big names, a lot of people don't know where to put you. And so trying to find those spaces that you could coexist, it has been difficult.
I gotta say, I think looking through your work, I don't know, maybe I never tried to categorize it. I just like, it felt so, maybe not fresh, but because the techniques that you're using, they're not traditional techniques, but they're not, I don't think, new. Maybe you can correct me on that. I guess the type of photography to me felt, I don't want to say unique. Unique sounds too vague. Personal. And to me, it still feels like portraits. It still feels like it's you, and it's very humanizing. So I like, that kind of makes me a little bit sad that others have a hard time defining, or I guess figuring out where to put your work. Do you think that that's changed how you capture something?
No. I think I have like kind of categorized my work in terms of like what I do to make a living and what I do for myself. And the kind of work that I've been putting up is kind of self-directed, and if I make nothing out of it, I'm okay with that, because then that means that like I'm not doing it for a particular audience, even though an audience is very much like part of the process, like me having a conversation, even if I never hear the other side. But what I meant earlier was like, I've spoken to a few like gallerists, and I've been even asked at one point if I had any actual portraits after showing and kind of going through like my process and like talking about but those are the kind of, maybe not like on a one-to-one scale, but for art as an institution, and to be able to like find representation, it becomes a little bit difficult. But I also don't mind too much, because of the fact that I've purposely continued to make work like this, knowing that it can create some type of barrier.
I love how you have given yourself the permission to have two different sides of yourself, I guess. One to make work, maybe that's a little more commercially viable, I suppose, and then one just for yourself. But I quickly did a Google search to define the word portrait, and it is it's a painting, a drawing, a photograph, or an engraving of a person.
Yeah, my work
is
very
doing.
Portraiture. Yeah,
that's
my
what
work
you're
definitely
doing.
is portraiture.
Yeah.
And I still put in a portraiture like category, because of the fact that like that was the starting point. Was I very much like photographing people, and I'm very much interested in the archive, and especially like as a Black woman and like a Black person, knowing that like within my own family, not being able to see what like my grandparents look like, even though I might have like a few pictures, but like, for example, my mom's side of the family, there was a flood, so a lot of pictures were damaged. So I probably have like one picture of my grandmother, and then the rest is kind of from memory as a child. So from as long as I can remember, I've always like photographed my family and friends. And because I walk a lot, I'm very much interested in like psychogeography, but I spend like hours walking if I can, and just documenting strangers and having conversations with people. I've always been interested in portraiture, and then once lockdown happened, I had no choice but to like photograph myself.
Yes.
And also, I wanted to photograph myself because you kind of start looking back on the images, or at least I start looking back on the images that I've taken and realize that, oh, I'm not in this picture because I'm the one behind the camera. And then just like that keeps happening.
I know that a lot of people are hesitant about being in front of the camera themselves, you know, but it is really important to you. Can you break down the why of yourself? So obviously, hold on, lockdown happens, right? You kind of have to take photos of yourself. But was that always something inside of you that you wanted to capture yourself? And how has that changed now that things are starting to ease up and get a little easier so that you can get out on the street and talk to strangers again?
Yeah, I always wanted to photograph myself, but I never knew how to. I didn't know what to do in terms of you set up a camera, and if my friends are taking pictures of me, that's fine because it's like that moment and it's that like I am not hyper aware of the implications of a camera, right? But then when I was alone and I was like, okay, one day I'm actually going to just pick up the camera, set up, and then just take a picture of me. And then I was just thinking, what do I want to remember of this moment? And there isn't really anything that is so significant for me when I was making those images in my house. But then, like I said, like I've always wanted to be able to like just take pictures of myself. And just looking at artists like Zanella Mahole and like who else? I can't think of anyone else, but just like thinking about like, or even just painters who painted themselves. And I've always been fascinated with that. And I always wanted to be able to do that. But I'm also very bored with what I look like at this moment, even though I know that it's not for me for this moment, but like it's for later. I'm also like, I also want the challenge of making images and something that keeps me engaged through that process. And just setting up a camera and shooting wasn't that interesting to me. Because I was still my audience, and I'm still my audience in the sense that like even like the work that is being shown now is because of the fact that like I've had to make it public, in the sense that like the other works that I've made in the past, I've never had to make them public, if that makes sense.
No, I'm trying to think because I think I said this earlier. I love the way that you think about these things in a different sense, I suppose, than at least myself, and I believe many other photographers do. And I don't know if it's that, you know, where are these ideas coming from? Are they coming from just, is this who you are as a person? Are they coming from the questions that you get from attending a higher level of education? Because I think that these are really important questions, but the majority of us aren't asking them. And again, I just find that really fascinating. So I apologize for taking a moment there and thinking to myself about that, because I feel like if more people could ask those questions, then photographs would be more meaningful and they'd be more impactful. A lot of it is self-realization and figuring out, I think, the story that you want to tell as a photographer. That's something that I try to talk about a lot. What's the story that you want to tell? You know, when somebody asks, what do you think about this photo? Well, what's the story that you're trying to tell here? Like, you tell me, because that's going to give me context as far as how we can talk about this photo. But let's get back to self-portraits here, because you mentioned taking out a camera, pointing it at your face, kind of boring. But I think that's what people naturally think of. But you take it a few steps further, right? With maybe some non-traditional methods with cyanotypes, photograms, which I didn't even know what a photogram was until I saw some of your work. How are these tools helping you to tell your story?
So, like I said earlier, like I'm very interested in the history of photography, and whenever I get into something, I become very obsessive, right? So therefore, I was not even just thinking about, I was including like taking portraits of myself. I was also thinking of the ways that portraits have been taken in the past, and then also like the history of photography. And it's also this idea of like legitimizing photography as an art in itself, but then also how photography has been used as a way of truth telling. Like, for example, if I sit in front of a camera and smile, that means I'm a very smiley person who's like happy. And if that's all people ever see of me, that becomes who I am. And, or if I'm sad, then so forth, right? So we create images and representation through like repetition. And I didn't, I think maybe I did a cop out where I was like, I don't know what expression I want to have at this moment. And so I will think about what makes me me. For example, with the photograms or the cyanotypes, once you get really close to them, you can see my fingerprints and you can see like my hair structure, and you can see other parts of me that isn't the first thing you'll notice in a picture. And I felt that like me actually lying and being in contact with the material was more representative of me at that moment, because of the fact that like when I'm working on the paper or like I'm in complete darkness, I'm just kind of free to play and do whatever. So when you do see the work in real life, you can actually see like my imprint, and you might not be able to know like the mood at that moment, but you can actually, because of like how much contact and how much like the papers felt more so than me. And I was also very much interested in like the history of like Black women within history and image making in that sense, and like, and wanting to be able to capture it, but then also finding it to be a very problematic tool. And I think too much. So I'm just lying around in my bedroom, just thinking and reading, and I enjoy reading, and like also got to a point where I just wanted to read a lot more like African history and like African literature. And all of those things are kind of like just running through my head while I'm like taking apart cameras and putting them back together. And then I was like, oh wait, I could just like turn my room into a camera and have like all the stuff that is around me become part of the process and like the documentation of me at that moment. And it wasn't really about like, and because the work requires I can make it, but then I'll like for example the photogram, because they're so big, I have to like roll it up and then put it in a dark space. So I never get to see it until I was able to like process it, and that could take weeks to process it. So therefore, like I was making images that I couldn't see. And so I was like able to just kind of be free to experiment and to like, oh, well, it's possible like there's nothing on it. Or like, I can't wait to see what happens when I put it through when I process it. Or like put like the RA4 machine. So it's a color processing machine that I work with, but that was in the university. Because of COVID, we were in like 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. So I'll be making work and then taking it in like a week later. And then I get to see what I've done. And then going back to my bedroom and taping it all out, because I've already like turned that into a camera, and I've even like dismantled my bed. And so like, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of what I'm thinking. I'm like all over the place.
What was that like when you forgot that first? Was it a cyanotype at first, or was it a photogram first?
The photogram. It was the photogram first, and I really disliked it.
Really? The first one that was developed?
Yeah, the first one I really disliked. Yeah.
Why? What was it about it? Was it a technical issue, or was it you wish that a posing issue or something?
It was more because it was more like sexual than I thought it would be, in terms of like it showed my figure, and but then it was also, it wasn't what I thought it would be, even though I knew that was what I was going to get, but it was a little bit more than I wanted to show off myself. And so therefore I feel like I was uncomfortable with the image and what it might say or how it could be read.
So did that mean you went back to the drawing board, or did you already have more queued up to develop? Okay.
Yeah, I had more to queue up. And then also I was very much interested in why I was made uncomfortable with the image. And I think that like being uncomfortable is a very interesting place to be in terms of like making images and like making images of oneself and portraiture and disliking or liking, but also that in between of not knowing why. And I wanted to investigate that in terms of like myself and being able to live with the image more so. Like there were elements that I enjoyed and I wanted to recreate. And then there's elements that I was like, oh no, this is terrible. This is awful. And also like I was making all of this in the dark, so nothing is straight. And that drove me crazy.
Especially as a graphic designer, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah.
So what conclusion did you come to about feeling uncomfortable about the photo?
I think it was like a my issue thing that like I'm still getting over, but I'm still trying to like grapple with it. But I think I'm interested in the images that I'm making. And I think I'm more interested in the images than the questions, than more so my comfortability with it. And I guess like, yeah, and I'm still trying to like understand that in terms of like the idea of even like a portraiture, like why you don't like a picture of yourself, or like how do you see yourself, and when you're confronted with a picture of yourself, how that makes you have to confront these notions of yourself that you might have. And this could be very superficial or psychological.
Yeah, I think that's a conversation for maybe another podcast. This one, no. I appreciate that. I appreciate you opening up and being honest, because I think many people feel uncomfortable with looking at photos of themselves. So putting yourself into a vulnerable situation and then having to self-discuss, I suppose, why you feel uncomfortable with it that's a big thing. That's a big thing. So with the photos that you had got, so I guess let me ask more of a technical question. Anybody who's listening, obviously, I'm going to try to put some of your photos in the show notes of this episode, as well as links to where they can find you so that they can see what it is that we're talking about. Because again, it's more non-traditional, right? So when it comes to these photos, say with the Sienna types, you had 8, 10 different photos. Like, how many have you taken? And then I guess, did you do them all at once, or is this kind of an ongoing thing that you can set up in an hour and take a photo and then come back at it next week? How does that work?
Oh, yeah. So it's ongoing. And it was also the fact that I was doing this through lockdown. So different processes, different stages, I would have to make an image. And it takes so long to take a photograph of yourself, especially when with the cyanotype, I was trying to create a collage of myself. So they're both of me, like, and so I exposed and make the photograms at home, and then I took it to, and then I'll take it to university and then use the studios to photograph myself behind it. And sometimes it'll take me a whole day, like about 8 hours to make one picture.
Wow. That's not exposure time. That's like from setting everything up to, okay.
Oh, yeah, no. So, like, I've got to a point where to set up taking about, like, 20 minutes. I've got, like, my setup on point. It's the minor adjustments because I'm photographing myself. So, and half the time, I'm also need to, like, make sure that I'm positioning myself in the right place. And I don't have a mirror. So, I'm just taking a picture of me if I'm then trying to remember, like, the position that I need to be. And then also making sure that I'm perfectly aligned. Although, like, now I'm starting to think that maybe I don't need to be aligned anymore. But at the beginning, it was very much like trying to get a perfect, like, silhouette or, like, a perfect alignment of myself or, like, of my multiple selves at that moment. So, yeah, it would basically take me a day, and then I'll go downstairs to like where all the technicians are, and they'll ask like, how is it going? And I'm like, oh no, I've only made like one picture.
I have a few technical questions about the Sienna type, because you're not using like a traditional camera, are you? As far as I could tell from reading on your Instagram, you're laying physically on photosensitive paper. Is that right?
Actually, so with the cyanotype, I'm actually lying on paper, or I've coated the paper. I've coated the paper or fabric. I started working with fabric later on as I needed to go really big. Otherwise, before I was like just seeing how much paper I had around the house and then just sticking it together. But then later on, I started working with fabric because I had quite a lot of like fabric at home. So I'm working with calico, which is like a uncoated cotton fabric. And then I coat it with, I always forget its name. It's like potassium ferrocyanide and something else. So it's like basically these two chemicals of one's like UV sensitive, and then the other gives you the blue or the cyan color. And then basically rolling that out in my garden and then just lying on it for like 20 to an hour, like 20 minutes to an hour, depending on how much UV is in the air. So normally you want, when you're doing it, you kind of need to be like in sunlight. like a lot of sunlight, but also just like a lot of sunlight doesn't equate the amount of UV light in the air. So
Sure.
it's just basically like me lying there for a long period of time. And so that means like every time I move, it gets recorded to an extent,
So
depending on how
there's,
still I am.
sure, as you would imagine with having such a long exposure. So there's no box that is capturing an image. It is simply photosensitive cotton. You're laying on it.
Yeah.
And then how does it get developed, I guess? Is that the right term? Or when you stand up, is it
it
done?
gets developed.
Okay. How does that work?
So when you stand up, it's still as long as it's in UV light, it's still developing. And so then to develop it, you have to to fix it, you need to like wash it. So you just basically wash it with water. And once you start washing it, you end up like getting a different color. So when you first coat it, it's a kind of like lime green color. Once it's like processed enough, it becomes like a brownish color. And then when you fix it, like wash it, it turns into that cyan blue color. And then also depending on the type of chemistry you use, you can get like a richer, like kind of navy blue, or like a kind of sky blue, or like a sunny sky blue tone.
Yeah.
But yeah, and if you don't wash it long enough and you still have the cyanotype on it, it can continue to develop. So it's, yeah.
You had mentioned earlier about putting yourself in your room and like turning it into a dark room. Was that to develop, or was that for a different photo process?
So that was for the photograms, because the photograms I was working with photographic paper, so like color photographic paper. And then I basically had like a torch, enlarger, like multiple ways of having light. So I had to because it's color photographic paper, you have to be in pitch black. Otherwise, any type of light is very sensitive to light. So any source of light will expose the paper. And then, so with that, I basically spent a lot of time blocking out my room. So they basically became like a black box.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that moment, I make the exposure and then roll the paper up, and then put it back into a black bag, and then wait for me to like go to university to process it. And so that means once it's exposed and it's in a black bag, it can't be exposed to light. Otherwise, it'll basically fog the paper.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I'll basically like go from one side of London to the other, hoping that nothing is like being exposed, or like there's no tear in the bag or like in the box, and doing that multiple times throughout the year, just like carrying boxes around with me.
Yeah.
And the possibility of there being nothing in it. But
right.
Yeah.
I would imagine that fear, especially when it takes all day, potentially to make a photograph, to have it potentially ruined by, I don't know, a bad zipper on your bag has got to be absolutely terrifying. I wanted to ask a question about exposure time when laying outside. You said sometimes it's between 20 minutes to an hour. How do you know? How do you calculate that?
Well, it was more because of I started to kind of, because I was making it a lot, I know what kind of conditions that I want. So like normally I want there to be a diffuse light because I want the shape to be a little bit I don't want the lines to be as crisp. And then also the fact that like if there is a lot of hard shadows, it's going to show on the cyanotype as well. Mm-hmm. Or like even the photograms as well. Well, cyanotype is a type of photogram because it's also like a contact print. So yeah, I was always like, I knew that because if I freshly made it, like the batch, and I'll basically make like 5 liters of it or something, and I'll make about 3 or 4 at night, and then in the morning later put that out in the garden and then lie on it, and then depending on the weather, if I get too cold, I'm just like, I've tapped out. I get what I get, and sometimes it's not enough time, sometimes it is, but like normally about 30 minutes is good. Sometimes I could even do it in 10 minutes if the weather was actually like if it was in the summer.
Wow. This is so crazy. I feel like we've gotten to this place today where photography is such a science. Like it's measured in the down to an 8,000th of a second you can have an exposure time, and there's still this world that, like, I think that a lot of us forget that we lived in for the past 100 years, where it's like photography was more of a feeling and there was a lot more flexibility, I suppose, in it. And it wasn't as much of a science. And it's, I think when you're able to get those happy accidents, maybe like when it all works out, it feels like, well, this is just magic. Like, this is amazing that everything worked out. That is so cool.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your creative process as far as, this is a new question that I'm asking everybody this year. And that is, when you are exploring something new creatively, is it easier for you to get, quote unquote, the shot that you have in your head that you want? Is it easier for you to get that shot when you're free to take 1,000 photos, or when you're limited to just being able to take one image?
Just one. I like being very exact because I don't like going through 1,000 images. Oh, I don't like going, if I just need one picture, I want to just take one, maybe two, and compare. But yeah, and I also find that once I get an image that was close to my original idea, and I want to kind of perfect it, the perfected one isn't as interesting as the first or the fifth one that I took. Like, the longer it takes me to make it and like kind of make it better, I start to lose interest in the image, or it becomes I don't lose interest. It becomes sterile. It becomes I can see my hand in it too much that I don't find it as interesting as like the kind of practice or the test. So a lot of my works are like test.
Does that mean that you're going to at some point give up on the cyanotypes, or not give up, but just stop doing them because they're going to be too scientific for you?
Yeah, I think so. I'm thinking of different ways to do it. And then also the fact that like a lot of people have done cyanotype. I feel like last year it was hard to get cyanotype like chemicals because a lot of people were making it because it's so accessible and you can do it at home. Whereas like most processes, you need a darkroom for it. So I just hadn't seen a lot of, or at least I hadn't seen anyone do body prints. And like at the skill that I was doing it at. So I found that interesting. And I found like I was already lying around doing nothing. Might as well lie around outside and do nothing for a moment and then see what happens. And yeah, and once I kind of have a new idea or something that like I can focus on, I'll probably move on.
Yeah.
Because then I know that I can do it.
Oh, right. Yeah. Suddenly it's like that. What's the term? What's the dog going to do with the car after he catches it? You know, like it's kind of the thrill of the chase.
Yeah.
And it's like when you can do it, or when you get there, it's like, cool, now what? So it's always figuring out, you think for you trying to push through, or do you just completely stop everything and say, what's something entirely new that I could try here?
Yeah. And I think it's like when I get to a point where either some idea becomes more interesting or I don't know where to go from there. But I always find that like I kind of go back, or like my work always has a connection somehow that I don't know or see at that moment. So like, for example, with the cyanotype, once I make the cyanotype, I take it into a studio and then photograph myself with it because I know that that's going to be challenging. Like to actually put myself in that position with the least amount of editing, like post editing as possible. That's like the challenge that I've set myself. And I like to play around with cameras and I love to like play with images. And so once it becomes less of a play and it becomes like, oh, I'm just like a factory trying to reproduce multiple things, then it becomes less interesting to me.
Oh, Melanie, again, with the deep thoughts there, this has been a conversation that has lived up to my excitement for sure. I want to say thank you. You know, now we're at the end of our time here. I got to say thank you so much for coming on and being open and being honest about all these things. And sometimes we don't know the answers in photography, but we all have to kind of figure it out ourselves. And again, I just really appreciate your take on it. Before I let you go, can you let listeners know where they can find out more about you and see some of your images? Like, where's the best place to do that online? So
I have a website that my amazing friends created for me. So it's kind of a holding place, but you can see a lot of my work through there. So it's melanieisakka.com. And then my Instagram, which is Melanie, which is MELONIE. LO_ONNY. And then I also have worked at Versace at the moment. So it's London Grad Now, which will be on till January. So that's like Versace in London. So if you're in London, please go and see it and see everyone else's work, which is amazing. Yeah.
I really hope that you enjoyed today's interview. I had 3 big takeaways. The first one was the power of constraints. Melanie found that placing constraints on her photography helped to enhance her creativity and storytelling abilities. So for her, by exploring these non-traditional methods such as cyanotypes, she challenged herself to think beyond a traditional self-portrait. And that, in turn, expanded her artistic toolkit as well. What kind of limitations can you put on your photography to have these unexpected discoveries and introduce just an element of serendipity into your work? I would love to know. Takeaway number 2 is that Melanie is right at the intersection of art and technology. You know, she talked about the evolving nature of photography from its origins as a flexible and emotionally driven art form to being transitioned into a more scientific, a more technical practice, you know, one that is focused on precise measurements and exposure times. She talked about the balance between scientific precision and the serendipity of happy accidents. And when you're there, it's those magical moments when everything seems to fall into place, just creating a truly captivating image. Really something. Lastly, the power of personal projects. She obviously has done a number of personal projects, and why they're so important to her, they're everything, you know? It's for her, dedicating the time to explore her own ideas and passions unlocked a new level of meaning and creativity in her work. And I guess that begs the question, will you dedicate time to explore your own ideas and passions in photography this week? Remember, photography is a journey of self-discovery. Your photos are a reflection of your inner world. So explore your emotions and thoughts through the lens. Until next week, remember, the more that you shoot today, the better of a photographer you will be tomorrow. Talk soon.
Thank you for listening to the Beginner Photography Podcast. If you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review in iTunes. Keep shooting, and we'll see you next week.